Well, welcome to the University Lecture. This, of course, is an event that we all look forward to twice a year, in which very distinguished faculty speak about their work. There's nobody more distinguished at Columbia than Orhan Pamuk, and we're delighted to have him do this. Second point, I only have three. The second point is that every time I have been in the presence of Orhan in private dinner one time, a very special evening, and other occasions, I just always come away with stirring thoughts and things that stay with me forever. His mind is a three-ring circus, and you're always trying to keep up with it, and you go away highly stimulated. The third thing I want to say is that Orhan Pamuk is a person who has actually suffered significantly for speaking his mind, for exercising freedom of speech, and Turkey is under some considerable pressure today with respect to freedom of speech and press. In the past, Orhan has been a direct, I would say, victim of efforts to censor freedom of speech, and I just want to say how proud we are at Columbia to provide him support and a safe refuge, as well as, of course, we're grateful to have him here because of his extraordinary literary accomplishments. Orhan. Now I want to introduce John Coatsworth, the Provost, who will introduce Orhan.
Thank you, President Bollinger, and welcome to everyone. The program tonight contains one deviation from our norm for university lectures. After Professor Pamuk's lecture, and before we open the floor to questions, we will be joined by my friend and colleague, Professor Nicholas Dirks, who will pose a few questions of his own to Orhan. Most of you know that after serving for 8 years as Columbia's Executive Vice President and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, Nick has been chosen to be the next Chancellor of the University of California at Berkeley. And I want to say again, as I have said numerous times in the last few days, how much we congratulate Nick on his accomplishments, his service to the university, and on this great new post, which will now create on the West Coast a kind of outpost of Columbia culture and scholarship. So, the task of introducing Orhan Pamuk is no easy chore. The first challenge is to choose from the many different ways in which to describe the man and his work. There are the subjects he writes and thinks about: class struggle and modernity, the nature of love, military authority, the psychology of collecting things, and the customs and traditions of his native Istanbul. There is Orhan's sustained artistic and philosophical exploration of the ambiguous relations between fiction and reality. There is the seriousness of his engagement with public life, as President Bollinger just mentioned, reflected by his statements about the massacre of Armenians in World War I and Turkey's more recent treatment of the Kurds. He was the first author in the Muslim world to condemn the fatwa against Salman Rushdie. And there is Professor Pamuk's status as a citizen of Turkey, a citizen of Columbia University, and having won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2006, which only one other author has received at a younger age, he is also indisputably a citizen of the world. Yet I am happy to report that I do not feel the least bit burdened about sorting this all out for you in a neat and tidy way. For in the world of Orhan Pamuk, this multiplicity and the tensions it generates are to be embraced and savored. Professor Pamuk's imagination conceives of a bricks and mortar museum operating now on a quiet Istanbul street, simultaneously as he breathes life into his novel, The Museum of Innocence. The museum, in turn, produces, naturally enough, a catalog and index of its voluminous contents called The Innocence of Objects. And that catalog defies easy classification as either real or invented, similar to the museum objects it seeks to analyze. And the museum objects are themselves much more than discovered facsimiles of the objects from a fictional world. They have, in some cases, helped to form the novel's characters and plot. In this way, Professor Pamuk inverts expectations about the relationship between objects found in the pages of the novel and those in the museum. It is a complex and provocative artistic edifice built upon discrete but sometimes intersecting paths of creative discovery. Still, this is an introduction, so I am honor-bound not to skip over the basics. Orhan Pamuk celebrated his 60th birthday on June 7th of this year. He was born in Istanbul to a prosperous family, including several successful engineers. His childhood dream of becoming a painter was followed later by graduate study in architecture and then journalism. Professor Pamuk's many novels have been translated into over 50 languages and won many awards. He has been a member of Columbia's faculty since 2006 and is the Robert Yik Fong Tam Mellon Professor in the Humanities. But this is not Orhan's first time residing on Morningside Heights. He spent several years at Columbia as a visiting scholar in the mid-1980s. For those of you in the audience who are aspiring novelists, you will be pleased to know that during that time, Orhan wrote much of his novel, The Black Book, while sitting in Butler Library. Now, please join me in welcoming Nobel laureate and Columbia's Robert Yik Fong Tam Mellon Professor of the Humanities, Orhan Pamuk.
Such an honor and such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for coming, dear President, professor friends, and student friends. Let's see if this works. Okay, I have published a novel in 2008 in Turkey, opened a museum in April of 2012, meaning this year, and just published a catalog, Innocence of Objects, of that museum here in the United States and also all over the world, again this year. I'm going to talk about what I did there. And my point about my lecture here is that I have two hats in my life, that of the artist or the writer, a person who does things without knowing what they mean, and then also the professor at Columbia University. I illustrate my position, and each time I start a class, I begin lecturing in a class here at Columbia, comparing myself to an I would say elephant, but let me tell you this story, which explains, every time I give a class, I give a course, I make this joke. I tell this story, which illustrates my situation and makes me, and also legitimizes my playful turning around, the way I turn around the story. I think this was in mid-1950s that the great writer Vladimir Nabokov learned that there was an opening in Harvard University for the Russian department, and he wanted the job of teaching Russian at Harvard, and so he applied for the job. There were people who were at the Russian department who wanted him, and there were people who did not want him. One of those people, I think, who did not want him was a famous literary theoretician, Roman Jakobson. This story links Roman Jakobson to Nabokov. So some people defended him, some people expressed their disagreement, and at one point, one person in the committee to hire a professor for Russian studies says, but he is also a great Russian writer. And whether Roman Jacobson or someone else said, well, sir, if we're going to take great writers for the literary department, then we have to take elephants for the zoology department too. This little joke illustrates my position at Columbia, that when I give my courses, sometimes I say, well, today I'm going to be an elephant, or sometimes I say, today I'm going to be Roman Jacobson or a professor. But it also paves way for a playful, for many, many ways of seeing things. Sometimes I am an idiot or a naive artist, someone who does things without knowing what they are about, or sometimes I am a scholar. When I publish my books, the regular question in Turkey, not necessarily a Turkish situation, a regular question in every country when I do interviews to promote the book, they say, you know, very simplistic, but that's how they popularize literature, artistic creativity. That, so, sir, tell us, why did you write this novel? What's this all about? What's the, well, you know, you gave 4 years for this book. What's the point? A bit of an aggressive question, which intimidates the artist, the creative writer all the time. And so you have to be smart to get around it or give a very direct answer. Of course, the question always misleading because they always, when they ask this question, they think that there is only one reason to produce a work of art or work of literature, while there are so many reasons to write that text, this work of art, that thing. In Turkey, when a book of mine is published, after I began teaching here at Columbia, after 2006, I had a legitimate answer. And they said, so why did you write this novel? What's this all about? It's complex. We don't understand it. Would you please tell us in a nutshell what's this all about? Why did you write this? And I say, I don't know. I wrote this. I followed my own humors. Some voice was telling me, of course, one day I will understand what this is all about, and I'm going to teach that in Columbia University to my students. But this will happen in 5 years. This little time change between acknowledging what you did, the meaning of what you did, and doing that thing is a very interesting time where I developed my theories, my ideas about what I did. And also, it gives me a sort of a freedom where I don't necessarily have to, even to myself, explain what I did. Let me do the thing. Then I will explain what it's all about. But here, now that I wrote the novel and published it in Turkey and also in the United States in 2009. And then I opened the museum this year in Turkey and published the catalog of the museum, another book that explains what's this all about. This year, I'm going to try to explain the whole thing to you. So I wrote a novel that takes place between 1974 and mid-1980s, but covers the whole second end of the 20th century in Istanbul, a novel which we can popularly call a novel about love, but a novel that does not put love on a pedestal, but tries to treat it as a sort of something that happens to all of us, almost anthropological, as if it's like a traffic accident, and the way we behave to react to love also shows our culture, teaches us a lot about our culture, history, attitudes, comparative humanity, so forth and so on. My idea, when I wrote the novel, I already had an idea that I will also do a museum. It's not that I once wrote a novel, it was very successful, so why don't I do a museum of a successful novel? It's not like that. That when I started to think of the novel, I was already thinking of the museum, and this was in probably 1995, 6, 7. You see this building? It was an old building. I'm going to show you the pictures of it. And I bought it in 1998. The novel, I begin to write the novel thinking of the museum, and I begin to do the museum thinking of the novel, while on the other hand, the museum is not an illustration of the novel, nor the novel is an explanation of the museum. There is a connection in between them, but the connection is not the connection of an old-fashioned text and its illustration relationship, but it's more problematical, more complex. So I had the idea that one day I will write a novel, and it will be deep, and it will be also deeply intertwined with a museum. In fact, when I begin to think of the whole thing, the experimental muscle in me was strong, and I wanted to open the museum the day the book, the novel, is published. In fact, the first form of the novel was a sort of an annotated catalog of a museum. Let's try to imagine in our mind's eye an annotated museum catalog where the annotations are so long and were so manipulated in such a way that it reads such a way and so lengthy that it reads like a novel. I begin to write The Museum of Innocence as a novel in the form of an annotated museum catalog with long entries, so that you begin reading it as a novel. Then after a while, I decided to publish this in an old-fashioned form, like a 19th century novel, did not pay much attention to the form of the annotated museum catalog. I'm telling all this to underline the fact that I conceived the museum and the novel together. When I was writing the novel, I was thinking of the museum, and when I was making the museum and opening it, I was also, in a way, honoring the novel. The story of the novel is very simple, but I have to tell it I have to tell this to you so that you have, to those of you who doesn't have a sense of it, have an idea about the story. The hero of the novel is an upper-class Istanbul man who falls in love with his twice-removed cousin just before he gets engaged to a proper girl, meaning a girl from his society and his class and society and culture. Then he is frustrated. Then, just like the Turkish films and melodramas that the novel is also interested in and describes a lot, the girl marries, of course, to another boy. Our upper-class character is upset, wants to pursue the married girl, and he cannot, while posing as a sort of an well-meaning uncle or a sugar daddy, visits the house of the girl for almost a decade, and since he is frustrated by the fact that she is married to someone else, he collects objects that are significant, that suggests their relationship, that reminds him of her, and piles them up someplace. Since the novel and the museum and the catalog is all busy about the distinction between gathered objects and collections, what makes a gathered collection, gathered objects a collection, what makes a collection, the distinction between gathered objects and collections, the idea of museums, encyclopedias, so forth and so on. All these issues were all addressed in both the novel, the museum, and the catalog. So more or less, I told you more or less the story of the novel. The museum at one point I realized that perhaps because of political pressures, perhaps because I could not find enough money, perhaps because it's so time-consuming, this or that, that I will not be able to publish the novel and open the museum in the same day. So I focused more on the novel, and in fact, that I was still writing the novel in 2006, 2007, and first half of 2008, when I was already teaching at Columbia. So I published the novel here, and then continued to make the museum. In a way, the museum is a sort of a conceptual art project, or conceptual art installation. And it's based on the novel, while on the other hand, it does not only illustrate the museum. The first object of the collection is perhaps the building of the museum. The story tells us that my characters, some of my characters, the main characters, lived in this building. So I had this fancy idea of setting a story in a real existing building in Istanbul, and then manipulating the story in such a way that this building in the end turns out to be a museum, then making the museum and opening it, making the museum and opening it as a real place was the whole project. And as we all know from our lives, that when you have such a radical idea, all of your family and friends say, "Don't do it, Orhan. You can't do it. Don't do it. Why don't you just continue writing your nice novels? What is this?" So I didn't tell too many people, and my friends and my family were right. I was also scared about doing it, and I confessed that I thought it will take much lesser time for me. This whole project took almost a decade. Now I am happy that I did it, and I'm happy that I'm talking about it to you, to the students of Columbia University. The first object of the collection that will make the museum is the building itself. Once I decide about the building, because of the story, because of the novel, the place, the neighborhood of the building would also describe the class base, culture base of the characters, would define the story. So it took me a long time to decide where, in what part of Istanbul, to find a building, set a story there. So comes our next picture. This is the cover of the paperback. Okay, so I find this building, I think in 1998, in a rundown neighborhood, not far away from my office, in a neighborhood where I used to take my daughter to school every morning. I was interested in this building, but I didn't know that it was on sale, but finally bought it. These are the photos of the same neighborhood. The one on my side is taken by Abdullah brothers in 1890s, and it's the next picture, parallel to it, is taken by me in late 1960s, when I went out into streets of Istanbul when I was 18, took photographs of the streets and painted and made paintings of these cityscapes under the influence of Pissarro or French Impressionists. This is a way of telling to you that I also aspire to be a painter between the ages of 7 and 22. And as I related in my autobiographical book, Istanbul suddenly stopped painting and began writing novels. So I research and research. Here is that photo at the top is the one photo that I took in 1969 again around the same neighborhood. And the one below is another photo that I took just 2 years ago when I was finishing the museum. You would see that the quality of life has changed, that Istanbul gets richer in the 40 years, and richer and more crowded. So the building was the first object of the whole art project, installation, whatever we call it. Then, of course, there are the objects. The museum is going to exhibit lots of thousands of objects, and I was going to write a novel looking at these objects. In a way, the idea is very easy that I decided that if I'm going to open this museum where all the objects of the characters touched will be exhibited, telling the same story in a different mood, different sentiment, different method, then why don't it will be smart to first find the objects, especially clothes, dresses, or anything, from a brush to a shoe, to a little slipper, to whatever you see around, and then own these objects and lend them to my imaginary characters, so that when I go on making the museum, I would not be wasting my time for looking objects. I would first say my heroine's name is Füsun. At the back, you see one of the clothes she wears. She wore this clothes when she was taking driving lesson courses. So first I found the cloth or the dress, then I described it very neatly, but not in a detailed fashion. Then once it's done, in order to do the museum, I don't need to research for this kind of flora or color, because I already had the object. So I wrote the novel looking at objects that I already had, or sometimes I went out the streets looking for objects so that I can put them in a museum, so that they trigger my imagination to go ahead with the story. Oops, this is a typical one that in the middle of the novel, to those of you who had read it will understand this, that there is a chapter that I wanted to describe, address problematics of the military coup in 1980s, but I didn't know how to do it. And there was a small flea market around my neighborhood. I used to go to the shops all the time looking for an object that I will buy, thinking that I will one day use and exhibit in my museum. Also, don't forget that the museum was a fancy idea. I was collecting objects and putting them in my writing studio, never assured that one day I will manage to open a museum. First, it's a financial situation. Second, it's a very slippery ground for creative people that all of your friends said, don't do it, it's not going to work. That all my life I had heard this chorus of people saying, don't do it. That's what I remember as I was doing it. So I came across this quince grinder, and after military coups, as everyone in Turkey knows, or in the rest of the world knows, once you are a suppressive regime, then city life is full of checkpoints, soldiers stopping you after 10 o'clock at night and looking at your car for weapons or handmade weapons or this. So I used this little quince grinder to illustrate the way soldiers mistreat you or stop you in the middle of the night or even at 11 p.m. And search your car. Now this object is part of the story. So, here, for a little shot we did for the museum, I exhibit, there's a photo of various objects that are displayed in the museum. You would see lots of cups, plastic fruits, which I loved collecting. I am an expert in plastic fruit and flowers. All these coffee things are not real. They are also the coffee inside these cups are plastic too. all of these objects are exhibited in the museum. So the more I collected them, the more I neatly described them and put in my novel. And coincidentally, these are, for example, a little shot from the museum. You can see how they are exhibited in the museum. And coincidentally, the flea market around the museum, which is, I'll say, half a mile away from my museum, there is a small flea market. It was actually a real flea market. No one pretended to be no shopkeeper at that time, at the beginning, pretended or posed as an antique shop. But now they're all posing as antique shop. This photo is taken in between the time in between. There is a slight curating here, but at the beginning, and as in these photos show, they were all gathered objects, and university students, poor clerks, people who needed mattresses, these objects. This is, for example, this one at the bottom is a mechanical taximeter, so forth and so on. There will be a lot of exchange. So when I finished the novel and published it in 2008, and I was already teaching at Columbia then, my little flat in Istanbul was full of objects, but the museum was not done then. It was not finished, and I realized that it will take a lot of time, but I wanted to do the museum. While politically, I was a bit suppressed, and I was not comfortable to go along doing the museum. Another reason for this distress or hesitation was really the money. All of my friends said, Orhan, oh, you can raise money so easily, you know. And then once I began to try to raise money for the museum, then there was 2008 economic crisis, which did not make things easy for me. So, when I published the book, my studio was full of objects. I had a strong idea of the museum I wanted to do. I already had the building and all the objects, maybe some of them missing, but they are doable. Then now I have to do the museum. The next question was this, well, what will be the logic? Here is the final outlook of the museum. But what would be the logic or idea or system of putting all these objects into the museum? I must confess that I already had made one major decision. Then I decided to put the objects in the museum in following the chapters of the novel. The novel has 83 chapters, and the museum, as you see here, is going to have 83, what do we call them? Boxes, cabinets, as they call them in Europe, or vitrines, whatever you call them. They change. So, and each chapter has a chapter heading, say, like, such as, let's read, Merhamet Apartments. So I'm going to call the chapter, the title of 7th chapter of the novel Museum of Innocence is called Merhamet Apartments. And if you come to the museum, you'll see the 7th box is called also with the same title. And all the objects that are described, or prominent objects that are described in the novel, are placed in these cabinets, boxes. You see at the corner upstairs, there's another floor upstairs, and there's the entrance floor downstairs. The museum has 4 floors, and this is, now the photo is taken from the 2nd floor. And the arc of the boxes, cabinets, more or less, I wouldn't say realistically, but sentimentally follow the logic of the story. Okay, let's see what's the next picture. Okay, this is just to give a sense of architecture here. I studied architecture for 3 years. I had also my idiosyncratic idea of architecture. So I was also involved in the making major decisions about the architecture of the museum. But what took a lot of my time, cost me a lot of worrying and anxiety. Creative writers know this, artists know this. What am I doing here? What's this? Am I wasting my time? And I had the full sense of a writer or a creative writer or an artist who is sailing someplace in the fog, who doesn't know where he's going to reach, but is persistent, had a sense that, well, I thought this is logical, I should go in this direction, I'm sure I'm going to reach someplace, but I sailed in the fog a lot. I didn't know what I was doing, but I persisted that I thought logically this will work. What worried and what cost me so much time was something I never planned before, that of placing the objects that I collected in so many years, say in 8 years, 7 years. Well, of course, the building architecture is easy, but I had these objects all coming from so many sources that I will explain, but how to put them in cabinets or boxes or in vitrines that will look nice to an eye. I have learned from my experience that, say, I have all the matchboxes that Turkish people used between, say, 1950 and 2000. And if I exhibit them, they don't look nice. A museum is a place that I thought should first look nice, that having the collection and exhibiting them like in a government museum doesn't count. I didn't want that. I'm not a government museum. I should both exhibit the collection of matchboxes. You can do it. That's doable. Then make it nice. That is not easy. So I begin to do these drawings. For example, on the other side, you see the drawing of one of the boxes, which I drew when I was writing the novel. Then the execution of this. This is I would say, lucky chapter, lucky box, because it worked. But then there were times that they didn't work. You draw something, then you want to execute it, and you hope that it looks nice. It doesn't look nice. This you all know, all the creative writer students, all the students of art know this. You plan something, it doesn't work. You have to persist, you have to go ahead. This is perhaps why there is some difference of 4 years between publishing of the novel and opening of the museum. This is one of the boxes that I like a lot. The title of this corresponds to 47th chapter of the book, the title of which is My Father's Death. Our protagonist's father dies. All the sense of guilt and father and power is illustrated by this little bedside desk or table. All of my friends and my father had this kind of bedside table, and when I visited my friends in 1960s, also my friends' fathers had this kind of bedside table in which tax papers, telegraphs, thermometers, boarding tickets, coins, some little notes, photos of old friends, insurance cards, medical bottles, old photos, passport photos, so forth and so on, are put together. Since my character was deeply in love and thought Turkish rakı, which is a hard liquor, is a sort of a cure for his love pains, in the museum we see a lot of them. Here is another one. Now, for the previous box, as you see, I draw the major composition of the box. But sometimes drawing or planning ahead doesn't work. As we know from our creative writing courses, from artistic creativity, that there is also a try and error part to art, to writing as well, that you plan ahead and plan ahead, it doesn't work. In the end, you forget all the plans and put the objects and see whether they work. Put the objects and take a photo and see whether it works. In the end, intellect cannot, our intellect cannot foresee the pleasures and accidents and surprises of the units of objects, the way objects talk to each other, the way unexpected sides of artistic and literary composition lies at the heart of my labors. In the end, I was working with assistants and putting things in these boxes, and we were taking photos all the time to see which one works. Here, I exhibit some of these photographs to illustrate the fact that no matter how much you plan, both in literary creativity and artistic creativity, there is something accidental. There is something unprepared. And there are always surprises. What makes a writer or an artist different from the others is that he or she can acknowledge first, identify unplanned serendipity, the beautiful thing that is not planned, that neither the hand nor the mind thinks of or plans, but just by the coincidence or just because you try so much, finally you find something beautiful. This I put here to illustrate the accidental nature of beautiful or composition. This is at the beginning of 2011, between February and June, I did not write anything for 5 months. I must say that I'm a very professional writer. I always work. This was the only time in my life that I stopped writing novels, text, anything for 5 months. I was very happy working for the museum, and I had assistants. I was working with a German architectural design company, and here I am working in the museum. Here is another box corresponding to the seventh chapter of the novel. Here I am illustrating the cluttery rooms that I have seen in my childhood from the cluttery rooms of upper middle classes, because perhaps the taxes of real estate in Istanbul is so low that I have seen a lot of empty apartment buildings where upper class, affluent people kept their old things. And in fact, in the story, the lovers meet in these places. Here is another one of these cluttery spaces where rusty old objects, old clothes, and in forefront, in the front, this handkerchief and this belt signifying things about male sexuality, fragility of female sexuality, and all the ideas that make this possible come together. As I made the museum, I also saw that a new generations of collectors are emerging in Istanbul, and in Turkey, and especially in Istanbul. The country was getting definitely richer and bigger and more ambitious, and I also saw that this new generation of secular collectors were not interested in the Islamic, Ottoman past, but they were interested more in their own private childhoods. I would say these new generation of collectors the way they behaved was anthropologically, culturally, was very interesting. They did not highlight the whole Ottoman culture, Turkish history, or the making of the new republic, all the things we may from here find interesting about Turkey. But they were more, not the national subjects. They were, these new collectors, were more interested in their own personal lives, and most of them were men, and they were a new generation of affluent, secular men highlighting their childhoods. And around the time that I made this museum, also the idea of collecting, not only in Turkey, had also internationally changed. When I began to make the museum, or the idea of the museum, a collector essentially was a person walking and working by his legs, that is, walking from shop to shop, from place to place, looking for one item. Oh, wow, what a nice bottle cap. And then telling his friends that I walked to find these 50 shops, and finally I found it, this or that. That was, as a book collector, as a book buyer, and many things, that was, till recently, how the collector behaved. Then, suddenly, all this internet revolution happened. Then the making a collection change did not depend on your legs, but only your fingers, where you tick, 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 buy and buy and buy and buy and buy and buy from internet. eBay, I began to buy. First, I bought a lot of things, walking and walking and walking, and in between, then I began to buy things from a company, which 2 years later, eBay also swallowed. That, remember now, eBay had bought over the Turkish version, which is Gitti Gidiyor. And so these are photos that would get out of film stars and football players. And these photos were produced in late 1950s and early 60s. You would buy a waffle to, say, 1 cent, and out of which this will come. They would be numbers. In early 1950s, people used to collect them. If you do the whole number, 100 of them, you would get a free football or whatever. Now, 30 years later, all these people, let's say middle-class men who collected them now, 30 years later, now would want them. Now they're all affluent and they want to collect this, not all Ottoman calligraphy, Ottoman miniatures, this or that. They wanted to collect things that would correspond to their life. Another collectors means the opening of the area of what is called internationally known as collectibles, a category, a very limited category that doesn't necessarily exhaust the whole human experience. In fact, collectibles corresponds to very little part of the extensive human experience. Another thing that the Istanbul collectors, men collectors of Istanbul collect is the photos of boats that cross the Bosphorus. The collectors, since second-hand bookshops or the clerks in flea markets knew about the desire to collect photos that show old boats of Istanbul, any photo that came to them would be put by the side. If there is a picture of a boat, that would increase the price of the boat. If you go to internet or go to meetings of Turkish collectors, which are on Sundays, you would see that there's a lot of heat and enthusiasm about collecting old boats of Bosphorus. This is a typical photo of a box. I love this box. This is corresponds to the chapter 14 of the novel. Just I want to express you how I wrote the chapter and how I did the box. First, I found this old photo of a little space on Bosphorus, Dolmabahce, and I liked it. This was quite early. I was writing a novel. I decided that to incorporate this to both to the novel and to the museum. So I set a scene of the novel in this place, then made this sort of an, I don't know, composition with the objects that are used in that chapter. Or here is another one. At one point of the novel, our protagonist Kemal, who is infatuated by love, says to the reader, he talks to the reader occasionally, as my characters do in my novel, says, here I exhibit, he says, here I exhibit a broken heart, he says. Now, the objects in the Museum of Innocence perhaps can be categorized can be divided into two categories. Some of them are ready-mades, Marcel Duchamp-like ready-mades, objects which already exist in the culture and life. Then I already find them in in a flea market, in an old shop, or in fact, most of the time, I would ask them from my acquaintances because it's hard to find these objects. And when there's the idea of collecting and culture doesn't exist, are not strong, it's even harder. And most important, that we only collect and save the so-called collectibles. But what about our old toothbrushes? No one saves old toothbrushes or old socks. They are not collectibles. We even hate them and we're disgusted by them and throw them away. But if I'm going to exhibit objects that correspond to daily activities of people of Istanbul, say in 1970s, how am I going to find these are the troubles, these are the things that tormented me. How am I going to find objects like old toothbrushes? So ready-mades were one category. Then objects that I produce with the help of artists is the second category, such as in the novel, there's one of these first Turkish fruity soda. So I produced that soda, then I went to people to produce the shape of the bottle and also the advertisement campaign, and I exhibit them in the museum. While here's a third category, something in between, where my character, who already has the idea of the museum, is now illustrating a metaphor. Broken heart is a common expression that many languages has it, but here I'm exhibiting a broken heart, which I asked an artist to produce. This is 28th chapter. It's again, all these objects have a part in the story. The one at the top is one of the first earliest Turkish toys that were produced by Turkish producers. In the last 10 years, the prices of the top train, which is called Ankara Express, perhaps a train is going back to from Istanbul to Ankara, the prices of these objects are getting higher. Maybe I'll go fast. Just to give you an idea about the relationship between the text of the novel and the texture of the museum, I'll read something from the novel. This will be self-explanatory. If the man it's all about the cult of virginity, the place of women in Turkish media in 60s, 70s, and how repressive society was to women. If the man tried to wiggle out of marrying the girl he slept with, and the girl in question was under 18 years of age, an angry father might take the philanderer to court to force him to marry her. Some such cases would attract press attention, and in those days it was the custom for newspapers to run photographs with black bands over the violated girl's eyes to spare their being identified in this shameful situation. Because the press used the same device in photographs of adulteresses, rape victims, and prostitutes, there were so many photographs of women with black bands over their eyes that to read the Turkish newspapers in those days was like wandering through a masquerade. All in all, Turkish newspapers ran very few photographs of Turkish women without bands over their eyes, unless they were singers, actresses, or beauty contestants. All occupations suggestive of easy virtue anyway, while in advertisements there was a preference for women and faces that were evidently foreign and non-Muslim. Now that we now I'm approaching to the photos. This is a photo I found early as I wrote the novel. The development of the museum was in a very primitive stage here. I like this photo so much that I enlarged it, as you saw in one of the boxes, box 47. Turkey, sometimes I thought, is a country till recently run, a peasant country run by soldiers. Many non-Western countries are like that. And here we see our soldiers drinking rakı, of course. It's something that they should never do. But they're so powerful, they are so proud of being soldiers. Who can ask them, what are you doing, sir? You are a soldier, you shouldn't be drinking rakı. But they are so, they're running the country. And no one can ask this question. They're happy showing you their rakı bottles. Another way I composed, if the term is right, the boxes was to make allusions to history of art. Here, obvious allusion is to 17th century Dutch still life painting, which exhibit a sort of an embarrassment of riches. Here, I have my plastic grapes, fruits, and it was all making a composition that would allude to other things. One of the boxes that I gave a lot of time, that perhaps sometimes I thought was a burden for the text of the novel, was this tombala box. Chapter 58 of the novel is about how people of Istanbul celebrated New Year's Eve, something since Turks changed calendar, and till recently, this was a new development, and the way the whole nation, or at least people of Istanbul, developed a sense of enjoying their bingo, Italian tombola, and since all families gathered around in the New Year's Eve in a sort of a Western way, grandfathers gave little slight presents. My grandmother, both maternal and paternal, used to organize these New Year's Eves and will give all these little toys, objects, cars to us children. And I thought that this will making a chapter, a long chapter about the habits of middle classes, upper middle classes playing bingo in the New Year's Eve will tell a lot about the culture. This is one of the most ambitious installations in the museum. There is 4,213 cigarette butts here. My protagonist, Kemal, collected the cigarette butts of his beloved because he cannot come close to her. The novel and the museum is also about communication in a culture where the girl and the boy cannot meet so as easily as in Western countries. When the girl and the boy cannot meet and negotiate their love so as easily outside of marriage, as easily as they can do in West, then a whole set of gestures, words, a whole set of rituals develop to express, to make a communication between two sides. I use, of course, these are not real cigarettes. Real tobacco would in 6 months will be spoiled. So we produce these fake cigarettes that under which I wrote sentences, which my character Kemal told me to write, illustrating the places of the, illustrating the little details of the story that the novel doesn't honor. Then I wrote them for quite a long time. It was a lot of fun for me. Here is another vitrine that again corresponds to the death of one of the fathers in the story. I'm going a bit fast at the end. I like this in one of the final boxes. I like this pocket watch, which is about the complexities of Turkish calendar, that Turks use lunar calendar for deciding which month we are this. Then also Muslims use sun to decide about the time of prayer. Then, as Westernization and modernization develop, also an interest in Greenwich time during the last years of Ottoman Empire, and of course, after the modern republic. So this led in the early years of 20th century to someone to produce a clock, a pocket watch, one side of which is European and the other side of which is Muslim. And when we were finishing the museum, so busy with these objects, my friends used to say, Orhan, this is East and West watch, a little watch, and one side of which is Roman numbers and Arabic numbers. And I used to say that, yes, East and West watch is me. And the museum has a philosophy of time. I don't want to go into it in fast, but more or less that correspond to Aristotle's idea of atoms. As we all know, atoms are irreducible units. You cannot break them apart. This is what Aristotle taught about atoms. Also, he taught about moments, more or less corresponding to for him, moments are more or less like atoms that they cannot be broken apart. If you connect them with a line, that line will be time. More or less, my museum argues that that every moment may correspond to an object, and if you connect the objects, you will get a story. Museum of Innocence, in that sense, tells you a whole story, both as a novel and as a museum. Let me see. Did I miss anything else? I tried to explain. No. Then, when I tell this story, I always tell to my friends that, in my spare time, I always read Aristotle's Physics. And finally, I opened the museum. I'm not going to say that I didn't know what I was doing, but maybe Nick Dirks has such interesting questions, I will be surprised. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Orhan, for that magnificent introduction to a museum that actually you have to visit. And the reason that Orhan asked me to open up the evening's questions, and I'm afraid we only have time for a few, is because I had the great opportunity last spring when we were visiting Istanbul along with the Columbia Alumni Association to have a personal guided tour from Orhan, of this museum. Unfortunately, since we don't have much time, I have to begin with the philosophy of time in Aristotle and remind you that one of the things that Kemal wanted to perform through the museum was to conquer time, to stop time, to arrest it. We can't do that tonight, so we'll have to be mindful of the passage of narrative. But of course, what is most extraordinary here in this museum and in this novel is the inextricable relationship between the two. You wrote the novel with the idea of the museum. There were times when you had to go off and collect objects, and the objects themselves propelled the narrative in one way or another. The museum was never going to be, in some sense, independent of the narrative, and as you describe the architecture of the museum, with each of the cabinets effectively representing a chapter, you've already shown how, in some sense, the two can't be prized apart. And so many of the questions we might ask, in fact, are about how the novel actually comes alive in the museum, and what happens with the novel when the museum isn't there. So, to what extent is the novel actually something that can be, in your view, freestanding?
I'm not happy going to the museum when people are there, because people recognize and immediately begin, would you please sign my book? And it destroys the experience in the museum. But before opening the museum, since I was working especially spring of 2011, since I was there all the time, especially in weekends when no one, I was working continuously with some 10 or 12, 15 people, and during the weekends they were not there. I would go to the museum by myself alone and work there and think, what's this all about? What am I doing? What am I going to tell my Columbia students in 5 years? So occasionally there will be a knock on the door. Some people who taught the museum, some person is open, hope to have a visit. And since the museum was not open then, but I will occasionally allow these people and watch their reactions to what we were doing. And what I'm going to tell you now is related to that. I have seen from these early visitors, and then also from the late visitors, this essential thing, that we read a novel, 600 pages, then I would say 6 months pass, and we only remember 6 pages. But don't be disappointed by this. We don't remember the novel word by word. I've read so many novels. It's disappointment to discover this, and I think people who visit the museum, my God, what is this? Is this here? Is this photo in the book? Yes, they're all, but no one remembers. This was a shocking experience for me. Then, but then it is also true about my experience of reading novels, and this is something I cherish so much. I worship novels in a way. So what is happening? What do these people do? They read a novel, 600 pages. It takes at least 15 hours. Then they forget it in 6 days. What happens is this. It's not that we forget the details. Yes, we forget the details of objects. We don't remember that object or what brand of cigarettes the heroine smokes. We don't remember the text, but we remember ourselves reading the text. But what do we remember ourselves reading the text? We remember the sentiments that the text triggers in us. We remember, in fact, not the text of the book, but our sentiments reading the book. But, and more or less, Museum of Innocence, not the novel, but the museum itself, illustrates those sentiments rather than the text.
But one of the things that the novel makes clear is that the objects in this museum may be innocent in some phenomenological sense, but are not innocent as the objects of the obsessive collection of the protagonist. So why is it a museum of innocence?
First, of course, the titles of my novels do not explain the novels. There are so many policies that the novelists make. Say, we go and buy The War and Peace, 2,000 pages, and yes, the title more or less sums the whole thing. My policy of book titles is not like that. Or the red and the black we teach to students symbolizes prospects of progress in society, which is still true in Turkey, either through religion or through army. Or there are titles which add one layer of mystery or which add another question to the whole subject, such as my White Castle or Museum of Innocence also is about that. Yes, innocence is about, perhaps, virginity. The cult of virginity is at the heart of this love story. But then there's also the idea of, for example, Webster's dictionary defines innocence as, quote, artlessness, that of having no pretensions of art, while my characters all watch the same TV, make the same, whether upper class or lower class, make the same naive comments on what they see in popular culture. So I was more or less exploring or making suggestive remarks about naivete, about all popular culture. This is, in a way, a modest popular culture of Istanbul, a museum like that.
Right. Now, your protagonist describes two kinds of collectors. There's the bashful one and the proud one. And at some point, in fact, you, as the novelist, who enter at the end, are instructed by Kemal to represent this museum in a particular way. And I'm going to quote from that segment of the conversation. Yes, that is the crux of it, Orhan Bey, pride. With my museum, I want to teach not just the Turkish people, but all the people of the world to take pride in the lives they live. I've traveled all over and I've seen it with my own eyes. While the West takes pride in itself, most of the rest of the world lives in shame. But if the objects that bring us shame are displayed in a museum, they are immediately transformed into possessions in which to take pride. Could you just say a little bit about what you mean by pride in that context?
Okay.
And why also, just to add to this, because we're going to have to close things fairly soon, why it is that you see this not just as something that is on a world stage, but very specifically for countries such as Turkey, where the bashfulness of your
I'll be very
these
fast.
two options are obviously determined by a particular kind of history.
In the novel, my protagonist Kemal argues that getting attached to objects is common to human heart every place in the world, just like love. But then we have love, or we get attached to objects. It's common to human heart every place, but then we have our cultures, our histories that makes us different from each other. That some cultures have, and that is, I mean with that, the Western civilization, have the idea of collection, then categorizing the collection, putting them on a pedestal, that is the museum, highlighting the collection with the idea that it's teaching so much about human experience, it's so informative, like an encyclopedia, categorizing, putting in a museum, talking about it in catalogs, is very honorable because it teaches so much about human experience and it is human information, human knowledge. While in non-Western world, where the idea of the museum is not that prominent and not that suggestive, that gathered objects are not collections, but only things that only illustrate that you have a broken heart, you have some personal problem, and you gather objects to find a consolation. So my Kemal, my character, who is, like many of us in Istanbul, in between East and West, has a sense of gathered objects because we are angry, because we are unhappy, so objects gives consolation, but we don't have a sophisticated idea of a museum that legitimizes it and honor the collection, not as a painful thing, but that's something that will enrich our human knowledge. Then Kemal realizes that if he poses in such a way that his gathered objects of fissions, cigarette butts, and all these popular culture things, if he honors them with in a strong way, with a conviction, and exhibit them in a museum, and pose like me there, then it will not be shameful, but it will be a proud thing, highlighting not only his experience, but also illustrating his culture, his times, his things, all the things that we also like to read in novels. So in a way, he turns around his embarrassment and proudly shows all the little things of his culture and his life.
You know, we're over time, but I'd like to just have the opportunity for one or two quick questions from the floor. So
Yes.
let's take them, and then we'll have to move to the reception. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to have you here tonight. Well, my question is not directly related to this, but it's a highly personal question that I want to hear your answer about, which is, as a retired aspirant writer, I tried many times to write, and the next day when I turned back and read what I had written the day before, I simply hated myself. And well,
This is a very common situation, though.
yeah, this is what I want to hear. Is it common? What do you feel about yourself when you read what you wrote?
That, of course, self-criticism is a good thing. You have to have self-criticism, but you should not be disappointed by your self-criticism too. It should encourage you. Don't destroy yourself by self-criticism. Hope for the best and continue doing so.
Yes. Please.
I guess I've heard you talk a lot about image and painting, and I was wondering what your relationship was with contemporary art in the context of this work, and there were things you were looking at that inspired you, or...
Yes, this is in a way a sort of contemporary art, but I did not go out and say I'm going to do a contemporary art. I did this building, this installation, whatever you call it. It's a conceptual art, installation, whatever. It's like writing a novel. You don't say to yourself, I'll be a literary person. You just write a novel. It's more or less like this. Of course, I want to see what's happening in the contemporary art, go to biennales and exhibitions as much as possible. But on the other hand, I like my amateurishness in contemporary art. I like my amateurishness also in art. In a way, I realized I was very happy doing this museum, but also tormented a lot. Just because it's a museum, it's a building, the plumber never comes on time, the painter says he's going to come on Friday, comes not that Friday, but the next Friday, making you lose a lot of time. That also cost a lot of time, a lot of energy, made me angry. But I realize that I am more happy when I'm involved in art, when I'm painting. I return to painting, but I feel I'm more intelligent and more engaging more deeply with the world when I write. I'm more calculating and I feel more intelligent when I write, but more happy and more in the world when I'm painting and doing museums on this.
So the last question.
Hello. You identified your museum as everyday collections, everyday objects. Do you plan to expand your collection, or are you going to keep the museum static the way it is?
Yes, very tough questions. Of course, now I'm a museum owner, and all museum owners are really imperialist. You all look at the next building, am I going to buy it? There's no end to finishing a museum. I'm going to add things to that. So many people are so generously advising me and telling me, Orhan, you have to add things, and museum is never finished, while a novel finishes. But on the other hand, in this period that I'm busy with it in the last 7 years, I again begin to get more seriously engaged. I'm more seriously engaged with art again. That the dead artist in me resurrected. And in fact, the happy news is that the artist that resurrected in me is now very friendly with the writer in me. They're talking. Maybe I may do picture books with serious text. I'm planning that sort of thing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're all invited. Well, thank you, Orhan. Thank you very much indeed.